I'm Alex Perry, host of the Practically Speaking podcast, where I simplify and demystify public speaking so you can say what you need and want to say. And I am over the moon excited to bring you this podcast. This is the first in a two-part series interview that I did with Gary Noesner. Now, if you don't recognize the name Gary Noesner, allow me to share with you who Gary is, what he does, and why I wanted him on this podcast. Gary is a retired FBI agent. He had a 30-year career as an investigator, as an instructor, and a negotiator. A huge part of his career was directed toward investigating Middle East hijackings in which American citizens were victimized. In addition to this, he was an FBI hostage negotiator for 23 years of his career, retiring as the chief of the FBI's Crisis Negotiation Unit, the first person to hold that position. He was heavily involved in numerous crisis incidents, including prison riots that you may recognize, right-wing militia standoffs that you would recognize, religious zealot sieges, terrorist embassy takeovers, airplane hijackings, and over 120 overseas kidnapping cases involving American citizens. To say that Gary understands communication, to say that Gary understands listening is an understatement. He has been in numerous television documentaries. He is a keynote speaker himself. He wrote the book Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator, which then spurred the Paramount Network TV event Waco, which now is on Netflix. So if you haven't caught that, you're going to want to watch this, and you're going to want to watch this before you listen to part 2 of this interview, because that's where Gary and I really get into talking about Waco. And it's what brought us together in the first place. Gary brings a depth of knowledge about communication and listening to this conversation that will blow your mind. You definitely want to be in a space when you listen to this where you have a piece of paper and a pencil so you can take notes. Gary is a master storyteller. He is entertaining, approachable, all the things that you would expect out of a phenomenal communicator. This conversation couldn't be more timely in the world today with everything that's going on. Global health crisis, societal crisis. This conversation is important, and what Gary has to say is incredibly relevant. And it was such an honor to be able to interview him for this 2-part podcast. So without further ado, here we go.
This is the premiere podcast.
This is podcast episode number 7. So number 7 for me, but first person I have interviewed ever.
Oh, okay. So
you're number 1.
This is either a great compliment to me or a sign of your complete desperation of finding somebody to go on your show.
Not true. No.
Okay.
All my friends think I'm super cool.
Well, I no doubt. You know, my mother used to love me too. So anyway, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think that's funny. I think it's an interesting lead into how we even connected. I'm watching Netflix in my basement, eating Cheetos, watching Waco, and get to probably like episode 4, where they're really talking about how, I mean, like at this point, they've really made David Koresh a very like sympathetic figure. And I'm sitting there in the basement and I go, oh my gosh, is this real? Like, I wish I had an FBI person to ask if this was real. And so from there, I realized I did actually know somebody who was a negotiator, Scott Talima. And I reached out to Scott and I said, Scott, I want to know if all of this is real. And he's like, well, I can't say for sure, but I can tell you that Gary's on LinkedIn and you can, here's his profile. So then I connected with you and I sent you a message after I'd watched the whole thing. Like, it was it was a little, it took me a little while to get up the bravery to talk to you.
That's right. I forgot. You're my first stalker.
Oh, your first stalker. Not stalking,
No,
just interested.
I'm joking.
But yes, but you were so willing to have a conversation. I thought that was really cool.
Well, I always do that. But my wife kind of laughs at me. You wouldn't believe how many times I've been interviewed by high school students doing a term paper.
Really?
I've done a dozen of them, or college students. And I said, somebody takes the time to reach out and ask, because most people are too shy to. I always accommodate them. I always find, I never say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's beneath me. I always, how can I help you? I just think you should do that if you, like what else I got to do, right?
Well, many people would argue that you have many other things, that your time is valuable. You only have so much time, that it's a scarcity mindset versus an abundance mindset.
Well, and I also think when you get to be my age and you've had the life I've had, you take mentoring very seriously, I think. I mean, I know I had some great mentors in my career, in my life, and and I think you see, the older you get, to see the value and importance of that. And so I try to take the time where I can and encourage people. And I mean, I've got one I got to answer now. This 16-year-old kid from France wants to be an FBI agent. As well, there's going to be a long haul for him,
Right.
Okay, but I'm not sure how.
It's pretty incredible. So, 30-year FBI veteran. You have been to every.
Now? Are we starting? Now? Are we starting now? Was that a segue? Yeah. Go ahead. Whenever you're ready.
So, 30-year FBI veteran. You've been to every state, 40 different countries.
Probably 50 by now, but yeah.
50 different countries. You've handled everything from prison riots by Cuban detainees. You have been in Talladega, Ruby Ridge, Waco, Daniel Pearlman. I didn't realize that you had worked on Daniel Pearlman until I started.
Danny Pearl.
Yeah.
It's not Pearlman, it's Pearl. But,
it's Pearl.
Yeah. I worked that case, and like I say, prison riots, skyjackings, right-wing
DC Sniper.
DC Sniper.
DC Sniper.
Yeah.
You have been in so many major crises. As you are watching things unfold right now, we are in the middle of a pandemic. We are in the middle of a great crisis in the country with Black Lives Matter, with George Floyd specifically, the rioting. I don't know what it was like in your state, but in my home city, downtown Indianapolis was destroyed over the weekend. As you're sitting back watching all of this, what are you thinking?
I think we need to learn to communicate and understand each other better. And sadly, in my view, the last several years, we're taking the opposite tack. And I was raised in the South, and in the 50s and 60s, and discrimination was pretty blatant. And I remember going to Jacksonville, Florida. I lived at Atlantic Beach, but we'd go to downtown Jacksonville, and the J.C. Penney's department store had water fountains for whites and coloreds. This is in the early 60s, and it was pretty blatant. And we went through the civil rights movement, and long overdue, and a lot of progress has been made in many ways. And I would probably told you a few years ago, I thought we were kind of post-racial to some extent. And yet, I think the last few years we found out that there's a lot of hidden racism that a lot of people in this country continue to feel. And it's come out. Charlottesville, Virginia is about 2 hours north of where I live, and to see what happened there. And, I think there are certain political elements that are consciously or unconsciously, giving fuel to that and dividing us. And it just goes against everything that I've believe in and what I've taught in the law enforcement context for my whole life. I'm by nature a mediator and a compromiser, and I hate to see people put into categories and then condemned for it. And you see it in social media, Republicans and Democrats. You see one side's blanketly condemning the other and vice versa. And it's just a terrible, terrible thing. I don't want red or blue. I want purple. I want everybody to be purple. I want us to find solutions and tackle thorny problems. Solutions are not easy, but you're never going to be solved if you don't make an honest effort to meet somebody halfway and to try to come up with solutions. And that's best done in a calm, intelligent, thoughtful manner. And I see us turning away from that in this country, and it disturbs me. And I'm not sure. I think what we're seeing, in essence, is a lot of fear, and it primarily manifests itself in old white guys my age. They see the America of their idealized memory as changing. They're seeing different people coming to this country, different languages, different colors, different sexual relationships, different religions, everything. And their world is turned upside down, and it scares the hell out of them. And I think that anger and frustration has been tapped into and exploited by some who feel a benefit by dividing us. And I think it's sad and unfortunate.
And the more fear, the more people attempt to control.
Well, I was going to say, I've also had the luxury, which seems like far too many Americans haven't. I mean, all the countries I've been to, I've had a chance to see the good and bad of almost everywhere. And the only continent I haven't been to is, Antarctica. And I've seen, for example, some countries that do things really interestingly, and in some ways, I think, innovatively and better than we do. We kind of grown up with this sense of American exceptionalism, and everything we do is the best, and we invented everything. And the rest of the world sits around there and just says, "Oh, I wish I was American so I could, be great like they are at everything they do." And it's just a myth. I mean, we have a great many wonderful things that happen in this country and that we've done innovatively, but there's other things that people are doing that are quite good that we can learn from. And
give me an example.
Well, I think you look at probably the big one debated now is healthcare. You look at some of the Scandinavian countries, and they're clearly different than we are, but they've decided to look at healthcare differently than we have, and to make it sort of a national right and an affordable thing. And I don't know what the right answer is here. I mean, I've always had good health. I can't imagine being in a hospital. I mean, your husband's a doctor. I can't imagine some impoverished person coming in with a young child who has some life-threatening situation, and you just say, "I'm sorry, you don't have insurance. We can't." I mean, as a mother, I'm sure you can't you can't appreciate that. I certainly couldn't, and it just seems wrong to me. I think we should look at how we can do things better. I don't have the answers, but I'm willing to tackle problems.
Well, and I think the thing that I find most inspiring about you is that you're willing to listen. You wouldn't have achieved everything that you've done. You wouldn't have had these great successes in negotiations and risen to the level that you rose if you didn't have this incredible ability to listen to other people. Can I read an excerpt from your book? That I think this is.
I hope you pick a good one.
They're all good, Gary.
Yeah.
But I love this. So this is at the end. And it says, if I've gained any wisdom in my FBI career, it has come from recognizing the degree to which everyday life can mirror the dynamics of destructive standoffs I faced in my FBI job. Each of us is called upon to negotiate stressful situations in business, social encounters, and family and lifetime again and again. From what I've observed, the happiest and most successful people tend to be those who are able to remain calm at these difficult times and put aside emotions such as pride or anger that stop them from finding common ground. We all need to be good listeners and to demonstrate our empathy and understanding of the problems, needs, and issues of others. I love that piece. And you say it again and again in the book. You say again and again how a lot of what you did was listen to people and you listened to what they needed. And that's how you solved the problem.
In most instances where there's disagreement in any walk of life, and certainly in the law enforcement context where we have some pretty serious ongoing conflict that causes a negotiator to respond, the people we're dealing with more often than not feel misunderstood, underappreciated, and unlistened to. It's not what happens to us in life. It's how we feel about it. So something that you see somebody reacting very strongly to something that you may laugh about and say, that's no big deal, but it is to them. The old saying, if you think you're in crisis, well, by golly, you are. And so the people, they want to be heard and appreciated and understood. And most of the time, that is the pathway towards achieving a solution. Because once they've been heard and understood, and they sense that, it removes motivation for them to act out in order to be heard. And that's an important thing for people to remember. And so, don't come up with your brilliant solution and be focused solely on that. There'll be a time for that later, but to make a suggestion of what are the courses of action might be taken. But the real thing is to appreciate the fact that we've got to convey to this person, I'm listening, and I'm going to prove to you I'm listening because I'm going to paraphrase back. I'm going to tell you what I hear. And if I get it right, you're going to say he understands me. And if I get it wrong, you're going to give me some corrective information that now I can really nail it. And that is a powerful, powerful way for human beings to communicate. Even if you're not the world's greatest communicator or responder, if you do nothing else but buy time and slow down the situation, you're going to make better decisions. What if you've had a big argument with your spouse? It's like, I want to kill him or he wants to kill her, whatever there might be. And then the next day it's like, it's not so bad. Because your emotion has ebbed, and you've had a chance to think about it. What are the long-term ramifications? If I really do murder him, it's probably not going to go well. And, there'll be consequences there. So, and I guess now I can understand a little bit better why he said or did whatever it was he did. So time kind of helps us to put things in perspective. It's the 24-hour waiting period to buy a gun, Mm-hmm. It's why you're best not to defend yourself in court, allow things to settle down a little bit. Don't make decisions when you're in this emotional high and say things. How often you've been told, don't say something in the heat of argument that you're going to regret later on. Don't tell your mother-in-law what you've really been wanting to say to her for a long time, deserve it or not, just be a little more discreet and realize that, thinking about this for 24 hours might be better. It's like most contracts, you have a kick-out clause. Yeah. Oh, you don't want that timeshare? 24 hours, you can get out of it without penalty. Okay. All those things are based on these kinds of appreciations of the fact that, time, as Mark Twain says, time heals, time soothes, time calms things down. And it's very difficult to maintain a high level of stress and anger and frustration with the passage of time. I mean, there are some people that stay angry constantly.
Right. It's a fine balance, right? So you talk about in the book a lot of making sure you're not, you would put in the time to listen to whoever you were negotiating with. And then the very careful balance of making sure that things were not said or done along the way that would take that away really quickly. So trust and credibility takes a long time to build with folks.
It does. And you don't get it simply because of your title or your position, your rank. You get it by demonstrating you deserve it. I'm giving you my respect, and that enables me to get that in return from you. Mm-hmm. That's how it works, basically.
How do you, in those moments where it felt like there was no time?
Well, time can work against you. I mean, if you're working on a deadline, or in the case you're trying to negotiate somebody and there's somebody bleeding to death inside this bank who was shot by the robber,
right?
That changes that dynamic significantly. But in reality, those are fairly rare cases. Mm-hmm. And what you would try to do in that example, so the guy's robbed the bank and he shoots the security guard when he goes in, and so you've got all the time in the world to solve the bank hostage situation, but you got a guard bleeding to death. So what you try to do is divide those out. Let's get this guy out first, because if he dies, this is going to not go well for you and so forth. And you and I can work on this other part of the problem. Let's get him out first. And that would be the approach that you would take, and hopefully achieve some success in doing that. And you have to remember, in that particular guy came to rob the bank. He didn't come to kill somebody. So
Right.
you got to look at motivation. Why are they here? It's a matter of keeping your head clear and thinking. I think it's the last chapter of my book. I start each chapter with a little quote that I think is applicable to that chapter. And near the end, it's about the quote from Rudyard Kipling that I love so much about keeping your head when all about you are losing theirs. And I think that's the sign of a good communicator, a good negotiator. It's being able to control your emotion and make better decisions. The very first thing we teach HOSS negotiators, the very first thing I would say is self-control. I mean, if I had a class full of 20 brand new negotiators, first words out of my mouth, self-control. If you
What
can't
are some of the
control
things that
yourself,
you do to teach them self-control?
there's some people that are naturally that way, and for them, you want to reinforce and acknowledge that is an appropriate skill for them to retain and utilize. There are maybe a quarter of the people that have no self-control whatsoever and will probably be terrible negotiators. And, you tell them what they need to do if they want to improve, but realize that many won't. And then there's that 50% of the people in the middle that, once they understand the concept and of controlling your emotions and being a good listener, they can really up their game and become proficient, and I'm probably in that middle category myself. I mean, there's some people that are just so naturally, intuitively empathic that they're going to succeed no matter what in any form of relationship, either positive or confrontation. But most of us have to work at it. Most of us has to constantly think about, what's going on in this communication with this person and how can I better influence the outcome by the manner in which I respond to them and treat them and listen to what they have to say. And we talk about active listening skills when we teach, and they're active because listening is not a passive endeavor. You don't just sit there and facial nods and so forth when you're face to face like we are here are certainly effective. But if you look at it just from a telephonic kind of a contact, we really have to demonstrate that we understand, and we do that by paraphrasing and by repeating. So, Alex, let me say what I think I heard you just say. And if I nail it, if I describe it in my own words, and it accurately reflects how you do feel or what you said, there's nothing more powerful that says to you, "Oh, he's got it. He understands exactly where I'm coming from." If we talk about publishing and the challenges you've had publishing your book, and I can articulate something that I went through that is similar to yours, I mean, it's a relationship building thing. And, we tend to do it unconsciously, but, if it's a life or death thing, a negotiator has to really focus on doing those kinds of things to build a relationship. It's not a sinister manipulation. It's just an overt attempt to create a relationship. People used to ask me, well, all these lectures you give and these articles you've written and these interviews you do, aren't you giving away your negotiation secrets? And I said, no, not really. I don't care if somebody knows what I'm doing. I mean, can you envision a conversation like this where I'm the bank robber and I say to you, Alex, I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to create a relationship of trust, aren't you? Got me.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. I absolutely want you to trust me.
Trying to convey that you care what happens to me. Got me again, So, don't worry about that stuff. Be genuine and sincere and trustworthy, and, you'll be successful.
Well, and I think what's interesting about the paraphrasing, I hear two things. I hear one thing that you're not saying, or two things that you're not saying, but that keeping the end goal in mind always. So I'm thinking as you're talking about these processes of compartmentalizing, right? Putting the emotion aside, prioritizing. I've got to get the guy that's bleeding out first from the bank.
Yeah, if we're still on that scenario, yeah. I mean that, but
yeah.
But again, that's a pretty rare component of it, where you've got the added layer of dealing with an exigent circumstance on the top. But
don't people treat a lot of scenarios like that? We walk into situations with emotion so high and so intense that we forget that the end objective is what we really want is a peaceful outcome.
Yeah, but people have there's a bit of tunnel vision, and when your anger rises, it just kind of constricts. This is what I have to do, and there's nothing else. And through talking and conversing and exploring and probing, we expand that perspective. There's a case that happened in Alabama back in the 70s where this police officer was wounded on duty, and he was retired while he was in a coma. And for years, he felt cheated and disrespected, and the chief of police at the time had called him a cowboy for having put himself in a situation to get shot. So, I mean, you can imagine his whole life fell apart, his ego, his reputation, everything. And he finally goes in many years later and he holds the mayor of the city hostage, at gunpoint. And the people negotiating with him are trying to say, well, we can do something about your pension. We can do this. You can do that. What is it you want? And when finally, for the first time in 10, 20 years, somebody asked him what he wanted, he said, I just want to be respected. I want to be able to go down the street and hold my head up high. And so what was really driving this behavior? He was, in one sense, upset that his pension was less than it should have been or non-existent. I don't remember the facts. But the fact was that the way this happened to him hurt his feelings. It's like when I retired from the FBI and I worked in the consulting business for a while, there'd be companies that would lay off through economic reasons, whatever. They'd be closing a factory or letting a lot of people go. And the ones that did it in a cold, uncaring fashion tended to have a lot of problems and a lot of potential violence and threats and so forth, because they put no thought into it. Hey, last day, sorry, economy sucks, you're fired, goodbye. And other companies would, have meetings, set up counseling, we're going to continue insurance for this period of time. They would do it the right way. And while people were about losing their jobs, they found it difficult to muster up the high emotion that they had been mistreated. Again, it's not what happens to us, we feel about it. So it's an important thing to remember, that we have to show people dignity and respect.
Well, going in with the intention to do so, right?
Yeah,
Remember.
Absolutely. It's like I talk about in my book, this guy that takes over an aircraft carrier in Charleston Harbor, and it's a museum, in Charleston Harbor. It's a USS Yorktown, and he goes up there and he's got a high-powered rifle and he fires some shots. And of course, the police respond, and we've got a crisis. And you can immediately realize that this is a highly symbolic military museum. It was on the 4th of July. Clue that this person is probably very upset about his sense that he's not been treated well by the VA or disrespected. And of course, the guy had, dependency issues and longstanding emotional mental health problems from prior years. And yeah, it was sort of his emotional cup overflowed. And this was how he expressed it. So when you go into a situation like that, you realize this is what I'm going to confront. If you just get on the phone with the guy and you say, listen, quit being an asshole and shooting your gun, we're going to have to come up there and kill you. I mean, that's not exactly the right pathway to get this cooperation. But you have to say, tell me what happened. You obviously feel like you've not been treated well and that people disrespected you, and I'd like to hear more about that. It becomes not only difficult for him to argue with you on a basis of a willingness to help and understand, but it's the pathway to get him to become more calm, to settle down, to behave more rationally and think more rationally. It's the pathway to success, and it works, and it did in that case.
So it seems so easy, right? Or it seems simple, not easy. It seems so simple. And yet,
the concept is simple, I think.
The concept is really simple. Why do we struggle with it so much?
Part of it, I mean, if you're looking at the law enforcement context, first of all, I think, police and the military, we have certain culture, and we're sort of trained early on to identify a problem, solve the problem, and move on to the next problem. And we have authority. We have the power to exercise that authority. And when we tell people to do something and they don't do it, it's a quick move from I tried the nice way and now, I'm going to play this other card. And it requires a lot of maturity and training and experience in a police officer to realize you can get a lot more with honey than with vinegar, and that's one of the things we talked earlier about what's going on in the country right now. And, I've always been a big believer in community policing, and you see some of these wonderful shots on TV of police officers playing basketball with kids and helping old ladies across the street, any number of things. I think that stuff is so powerful, that you take the time and effort to create an opportunity to demonstrate that you're a good person there to help them, not to ruin their life. And it's a powerful tool. And probably, I know in the FBI, for every hour of training, well, I should say this, there's a small amount of training for communication skills compared to firearm skills. We had to, it's an essential skill. You have to be able to carry a weapon and potentially use deadly force. So it requires a great deal of training to be able to do that proficiently and safely and so forth and so on. I understand that. I don't question any of it. But if we put as much effort into communicating, perhaps we'd be better off. There was a small police department in Florida many, many years ago, that relatively small police department that decided to train its entire police force as negotiators, to give them negotiation training. Their SWAT team callouts reduced 80% in a short period of time. Because what was happening, rather than allowing these confrontations to escalate, officers were better equipped to de-escalate. The manner in which they engaged with the public, the manner in which they handled the tough situation. I learned this very early in my FBI career when I was assigned to arrest fugitives. And these would be people that committed serious crimes in some other state. They would be found in South Carolina, and we would go arrest them and extradite them back to whatever state it was. That was a big role the FBI played in those days. And I worked with two guys, essentially, and one was really bad at talking to people. Even though he was a senior agent, I'm supposed to be learning from him. He just had a way of pissing people off. It was just terrible skills. And then I worked with another agent who was smooth as silk. He was actually a bigger, tougher guy, but he knew how to talk to people and get them to comply and to cooperate. And, we had much less occasion to become physical. I mean, with the other guy, it seemed like I'm ruining these suits that I couldn't afford. We're rolling in the dirt fighting people. And this other guy would get them to come voluntarily. And I said, well, I'm pretty sure I know which one I want to copy.
Right. Which one to follow. And when the evidence is so clear that the communication training works, that it saves lives, that it de-escalates events, why? I still go back to, why are we not investing in this? We don't invest in it in general. So coming from the public speaking world and looking at how communication is taught or not taught in the school systems and all throughout, we go immediately to, what am I going to say? What am I going to say?
Yeah.
Versus how I'm going to listen.
No, I think that's right. And, I saw some of the pictures again, more on Facebook than on the big news, is you see a couple cities, the chief of police and some of the police officers are getting down on the knee with the protesters. Yeah. They're walking down the street with them. I mean, that's beautiful stuff. And it's saying, I hear you, I listen, I understand. And it makes it very hard to argue with somebody that's responding to you in that way. I mean, one of my very good friends was the chief hostage negotiator in Hong Kong. And many years ago, and they're having some pretty terrible situations there now, but years ago, they had more of a minor problem. And he got his department, they got out water for the protesters. They kind of led them into a very peaceful activity by the way they engaged with it, using communication skills. And, near the end of my career, we had to remove some protesters from the island of Vieques. I talk about it in my book in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
It was a bombing range that the Navy used since World War II. And the people of Puerto Rico, certainly a certain segment of them, wanted it back, and they occupied it. And we had to remove them. And there was a plan to do it in a very quick and decisive way. And then we found out the news media was there. So we came up with a plan to do it in a more thoughtful and slow and patient way. And we didn't wear all the garb. We just put on golf shirts and chinos and walked up to the people and said, hey, man, this is really important to you and I want to hear about it. But I'm just concerned you're going to get hurt here in the range. Everybody complied. They walked off safely. Nobody resisted. It was a beautiful thing to see. And it was because of communication skills. And that's something we have to learn to do more. Now, I'm saying all that. That doesn't work in the middle of a riot. I mean, if somebody's throwing a firebomb at you, you can't say, hey, let's have a chat about what kind of bottle you're using, but
before it gets to that point,
to help you express what can I do to help you express yourself?
Yeah.
Because it sounds to me that what you want to say is very important to you and it's an important message. And we just want you to be safe. We don't want you to get hurt. And we don't want you to, inadvertently let someone hurt somebody else who's trying to get back in business after this terrible shutdown from the virus, so let's work together to make this, you get the attention you want, you send the message you want, everybody's safe. There are ways to achieve that more often than not.
What I hear over and over again in your stories and in the writing is sitting and listening to people and how often it is the basic fundamentals that people want. They want respect. In many instances, they want something very, very simple. So Charlie Leaf wanted his clean clothes, or the inmates in Talladega were hungry. Like, they wanted very, very basic things that are actually really easy for us to provide to other people if we would take the time to establish the trust and ask them what they really need.
I've got a good example of that. I think I mentioned it in the book. Sometimes I forget what I put in the book when I haven't. I speak so much, or I used to, but I got called on the phone once to help in San Antonio, Texas. They had a guy during Fiesta, the big event they have every year. The guy climbs up a radio tower and he's going to commit suicide. And they tried to get him to come down. They couldn't hear him. He's up there 100 feet in the air and they're yelling and screaming back and forth, the cops and him. And they finally called me up and they said, you got any ideas? And I said, well, has he asked for anything? Mm-hmm. And they said, yeah, he wants a cigarette. I said, well, did you give him the cigarette? And they said, well, what do we get for it? I said, what were you expecting? What do you want him to do? Pull one of his arms off and throw it down to you? I mean, you think he came up there? You think he climbed the tower today in order to get a cigarette? There's an easier way to get a cigarette. You go in front of a 7-Eleven and you wait for somebody to come in. You say, do you have a cigarette I can have? And probably 9 out of times, if somebody's a smoker, they'll give him a cigarette. Yep. You don't have to climb a radio tower to do that. So we have to therefore assume there's other issues and problems and concerns that he's dealing with. So if we want to show that we're there to help him and not hurt him, the question shouldn't be, what do we get for it? The question is, what do we lose? Give us a couple cigarettes. And they did. They put them in a baggie and they put them halfway through and they told him what they were doing. We're going to put the cigarettes here, then we'll come back down. You feel comfortable, you can come down and have the cigarettes. All of that conveys that the police are nice guys. They're not here to screw around with him, make his day worse. And he ultimately came down. And that's the kind of thinking, I ran into it even at Waco when David Koresh wanted to broadcast a national message, And of course, our bosses are saying, well, what do we get for it? What do we get for it? And I said, I don't know, maybe nothing. But more importantly, what do we lose? He says he'll come out if we play it. He ended up not doing that. But what did we really lose? We lost nothing. Some radio station, Christian Broadcast Network, broadcast his 58-minute message. And all right, so what? People hear what's important to him. We listen to it. It wasn't suicidal. So, but I think it's a way of thinking that, particularly in the male world, in the male law enforcement and military world, we immediately get into this jousting conflict thing. Well, I'm not going to make a concession. You got to make the concession. And instead, it's like saying, okay, no big deal. I can do that.
Well, and what you might gain in the long run.
A guy might say in a situation, I don't want to get dragged out in front of my neighbors. I'll be embarrassed if I surrender. I said, well, okay, how about we do the back door? Would that make you feel more comfortable? We'll put you in a van so the public can't see you. They don't want to be humiliated. Can we make reasonable accommodations that don't really cost us anything to accommodate somebody's concerns and needs? And my answer is almost whenever we can, we should.
Truly serving others before you serve yourself.
Well, it's not also altruistic. I mean, we negotiate primarily to keep police officers safe, so we don't have to go inside and confront a dangerous person. Of course, we care about them. We care about whoever victims or hostages they have in there. So it's a fairly pragmatic approach, but I also think it's just the right thing to do. The public sees in law enforcement, they see how we treat other people. I mean, they're not, as we can see, look what's going around the country. All this protest going around the country as we speak is not because of one incident. It's a sense, right or wrong, that people have that the police are abusing a certain segment of the population. So it's sort of an emotional outburst here. So we have to be cognizant in the law enforcement business that which we do should work very hard at conveying, that we're public servants and we have to enforce the law. We will enforce the law, but we'll do it fairly. And we use force not because we can. We use force only because the behavior of the perpetrator, for lack of a better term, leaves us no option. I should be able to stand in front of a court of law, court of public opinion, and say, we took this action against Alex because she did X, Y, Z. She said these things, she did these things, she made these threats, she took these actions. I can articulate very specifically the things, the behaviors that you engaged in that any neutral person would say really left me no alternative. I had to exercise force. That's the threshold we have to face. I can't just say, I got tired of dealing with her. She's a pain in the neck, and I was late and I wanted to get home for dinner and I just didn't have time for this crap. So I hit her over the head, put her in the car and off we went. That doesn't cut it. That doesn't cut it. We have to make that compelling case. And even then, sometimes the public's, there's a distrust with the police or authority, whatever it might be, and so be it. I mean, there's people, I mentioned to you earlier, in some of the interviews I've done about the Waco show, there are people that want to believe that the big bad government says, hey, what are we doing this week? Oh, nothing. Let's go out and kill a bunch of religious cult people, that we think are weird. That's sort of a simplistic approach to a very complex problem. Yeah. But there are people that want things to be black and white, good guy, bad guy, Republican, Democrat, religious, not religious, whatever. It's so easy to divide and pigeonhole us into different categories when we ought to be thinking a little differently, I think.
More in the gray. We stop here. I will continue the conversation with Gary, talking about his experiences at Waco and giving you even more information about communication and effectively listening. I can't wait for you to listen to part 2 of my series with Gary. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I'm Alex Perry, host of the Practically Speaking podcast. You can find me wherever you get your podcasts, so please do find me and hit subscribe. I would love to have you join me on this journey. You are not going to want to miss part 2 of this series, so please follow me. You can follow me on all the social media outlets at PS with Alex, except for Twitter, because I don't do Twitter, because Twitter scares me. I can't wait for you to hear the next part of this interview with Gary. Until then, have a phenomenal day, and thank you so much for listening.